Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I appreciate the thoughtful discussion that we've had today between my colleague from Mississippi and my colleague from the state of Washington. I also appreciate the thoughtful insight that the senator from Louisiana provided in his remarks. I feel it necessary to address a couple of issues that were raised by my friend and distinguished colleague from the state of Washington. There are differences that members have, differences of opinion, when it comes to a wide variety of issues. When it comes to abortion, people have different approaches that they take. I know my own view, and I know the views taken by many of my Democratic colleagues. But it's important to point out here what we are talking about and what we're not talking about. One of the first arguments that we heard today from the senator from Washington related to Roe versus Wade. And as long as we're on the topic of imputing to another person improper motives or motives not apparent on the face of a piece of legislation, if one is going to impute to the senator from Mississippi the intention of undoing a Supreme Court precedent, I'd like to point out that is manifestly not within the scope of this legislation, nor is it the place of any senator to purport to know the subjective motivation behind Senator Hyde-Smith's legislation here. So I'm not going to purport to know the reason why she said that. I just want to point out that is not the point of this bill. This bill has nothing to do with Roe versus Wade. You can feel however you want about Roe versus Wade. This isn't it. So I know that's a convenient excuse to not have to deal with something real, something that has to do with the lives and the health and the well-being of women, to say nothing about the unborn human lives within them. From those who would invoke science in opposing this bill, I'd ask, on what planet does the science back the idea that we should remove the REMS restrictions from this supposed so-called form of health care? A form of health care that, as I mentioned a few moments ago, has resulted in thousands upon thousands of complications in the 2 decades that it's been on the market. On what planet can one contend that one can't support this legislation without being opposed to science? Back to the Roe versus Wade question. If every single time someone gets up to try to present legislation that, as far as I can tell, the senator from Washington wasn't claiming was outside of our legislative purview as federal lawmakers, if every single time someone gets up to try to raise legitimate questions of public policy regarding the health, safety, and welfare of the American people, of the American patient, of American women subjected to very serious side effects from a piece of legislation. If no one can present legislation without being accused of trying to undo a 1973 court decision, which is on its face not even at issue in this legislation, then we're going to have a hard time carefully considering these things. Now, last I checked, it is our job to decide questions of public policy, questions that are squarely within our federal jurisdiction. Now, one could argue, I suppose, about whether it was a good idea to put exclusive jurisdiction over the regulation of pharmaceuticals in this country under the FDA. One could make that argument. I don't understand the senator from Washington to be making a federalism argument. If she wants to have that conversation, I'd love to have that with her. That'd be fantastic. In fact, look, I'd love to raise federalism concerns anytime we're discussing anything because it's far too seldom invoked here. But that's not what this is about. What that argument was about was instead that the senator from Mississippi supposedly is trying to overturn Roe versus Wade, and it couldn't possibly be the fact that she's there genuinely concerned about the thousands upon thousands of injuries that have been sustained as a result of this barbaric form of so-called medical treatment. Can't possibly be that. If that's the case, if those who were so determined to make everything about Roe versus Wade, if they're right and if they're to have their way, then I guess we can't discuss anything, even related to women's health, that affects pregnancy. Surely that's not the argument. That can't be the argument. And I don't think anyone, regardless of how they feel about Roe versus Wade, regardless of how they feel about government's role in abortion or not, if what we're talking about is the fact that we ought not loosen certain restrictions so as to allow people to gain access to an abortion cocktail that is dangerous under many circumstances, especially when administered without any kind of direct medical supervision or attention. If that's where we are, that's not good. That's messed up. Something's terribly wrong if we can't have a conversation about women's health without being accused of wanting to undo an entire line of precedent dating back to 1973. Now, yeah, look, guilty as charged. I have my own views about that line of precedent. Those views are no secret. Those views are well-founded as a matter of science. They're well-founded as a matter of hundreds of years of American constitutional law, of common law. But I understand they're not the only views. But you cannot, Mr. President, simply walk in here and say that because this addresses a type of abortion procedure, and because Roe versus Wade reached the conclusion that it did, anyone who proposes a piece of legislation like the one that's been proposed by Senator Hyde-Smith today necessarily has as its object, as her subjective motivation behind filing that legislation, the undoing of Roe versus Wade. And because that is her supposed subjective motivation, we can't even have the conversation about what this does for women's health. To say, let's draw the line and let's not remove the REMS restrictions. Let's not let people order these through the mail and be administered these dangerous drugs without direct medical supervision. The next line of reasoning used by the senator, my friend and distinguished colleague from the state of Washington, is that we're in the middle of a global pandemic. Yes, we are. But last I checked, Mr. President, that doesn't prevent or preclude us from discussing and addressing other things, from the funding of the government to presidential nominees who we confirm or don't confirm. It doesn't preclude us or excuse us from considering other pieces of legislation. So I'm struggling to understand how the existence of a global pandemic means that we can't even address another type of epidemic, one brought about potentially as a result of the abusive prescription and reckless misuse of abortion-inducing drug cocktails. This is beyond my ability to understand. It's also beyond my ability to understand how a simple requirement that before one of these drugs be administered, that the patient should have at her disposal a medical examination and some kind of medical attention. Nothing about Roe versus Wade says that you can't have laws restricting the manner in which abortions are performed. Nothing about Roe versus Wade says that a state or Congress itself may not require that abortions be performed by healthcare professionals under the supervision of a board-certified medical doctor. Nothing about Roe versus Wade carries any implication for this. This legislation simply says, let's make sure that medication like this not be used to harm American women. I know that I have other colleagues wishing to discuss this topic and other topics, but Mr. President, let me say this. Human life matters. Every human life means something. You can't snuff it out and pretend it doesn't exist, because it does. Every life matters to God. It matters in the universe. Whether you believe in God or not, life matters. You can't pretend it doesn't exist. Every life is unrepeatable, irreplaceable. We should vow to protect it. For those who aren't interested in protecting unborn human life, let's at least focus on protecting the human lives that we all agree exist. That's what this legislation is about. Shame on us if we can't even do that. Thank you.